Hi everyone, today I'm going to show you my favorite way of drawing trees. As long as you already know how to shade cylinders and spheres, you should be able to do this drawing. So here's the plan. Basically, we're just going to create a bunch of spheres and a cylinder and add texture. We'll create the texture by using a couple of very simple lines. The first one looks like this and is basically just a bunch of U's that are connected. The other is a mark-making technique called scumbling, which is kind of like scribbling except the lines are a little bit more controlled and swirly. And as with all colored pencil drawings, we'll also be using different pencil pressures, which is just how hard or softly you're pressing down on the pencil. Generally, you'll get a lighter pencil pressure if you hold your pencil towards the end, and a heavier pencil pressure if your grip is closer to the point. Now, let's pick out some colors for the leaves. Today, I want to draw a very bright and saturated green tree. So I'm going to use lemon yellow, spring green, and Copenhagen blue for the leaves, and light umber, dark umber, and white for the trunk. If you don't have these exact colors, don't worry. The main thing is that you'll want to choose at least 3 colors, with one of them having a light value, one having a medium value, and one having a dark value. Now let's get into the sketch. Using a 2B or HB pencil with a light pencil pressure, let's draw a really wavy blob. This will be the guideline for the leaves. Just under it in the center, we'll draw a narrow rectangle for the trunk. Now within the wavy blob, let's put a bunch of circles. These can pretty much be whatever size you want, but I like to get a nice mix of larger ones with a few smaller ones. Feel free to leave some empty spaces between the circles as well. Next, we're going to use a kneaded eraser to lighten the sketch. If you don't already have a kneaded eraser, you can use a regular eraser and just lightly drag it across the sketch. The goal here is just to erase the sketch just enough so that it's barely visible, but you can still kind of see it. Now let's clean up the sketch a little bit. Using a jagged and uneven line, outline the outer edge of all the circles and the negative space in between them. And then inside of those negative spaces, we can also add a couple branches. And that's pretty much it for the sketch. Once again, let's lighten our sketch, and then we can move on to adding some color. So for the first phase of the drawing, we're going to be blocking in all of the colors using a light pencil pressure. After establishing a light source, the first thing I like to do when approaching any drawing is to block in the darkest shadows first. Using our darkest leaf color, which is Copenhagen blue, let's fill in the areas between the circles and the branches using a light pencil pressure. Once again, the more you hold your pencil towards the end, the easier it'll be to achieve a light pressure. To help us find the other shadows, I want you to start thinking of all of these circles as spheres from now on. You don't need to think of them as perfectly accurate spheres, but more just in the sense that these are 3-dimensional round forms that have highlights, midtones, and shadows. So with that said, you'll want to use your prior knowledge about shading spheres to figure out where the darkest shadows are going to be. So keeping in mind that our light source is here, we know that the core shadows should be approximately here, so let's block in all of those shadows. Continuing with that light pencil pressure, let's shade in the spheres using spring green for the midtone areas and lemon yellow for the highlights. After we've done this, let's add an even layer of light umber onto the trunk. We won't worry about shading the trunk quite yet. For now, we'll just focus on shading the leaves. Now let's move on to the second phase of the drawing. In this stage, we're generally going to be using a medium pencil pressure as we start to add in some texture. So now we're going to start by taking our darkest color, Copenhagen blue, and putting in a bunch of connected U's in the shadow areas with a medium to heavy pencil pressure. In other words, we'll just be putting these wherever we blocked in the Copenhagen blue before. Let's also put a couple of clusters of these U's just randomly coming out of the shadows. Then using spring green and a medium pencil pressure, we can scumble over all of the blue U's and slightly around them too. After that, we can throw in some more heavy pencil pressure blue U's into the shadows. After we've done that, let's fill in the rest of the leaves with lemon yellow. To fill in this area, let's do some tighter scumbling using a medium pencil pressure. We can also continue scumbling into the shadows just to help blend everything together. So now I'm looking at my drawing and still thinking of all of these as spheres. I'm noticing that I'm happy with the amount of shadow, but the highlight area is too big and the midtone area is too small. You may or may not also have this problem, but if you do, we can fix this by scumbling with spring green into that highlight area. As I bulk up the midtone, I'm also pushing it into the highlight area in a wavy, uneven way. This helps to make the sphere look more lumpy and more organic. Then let's go back to putting in some more dark blue U's into the shadows, and just adding a couple more clusters of U's, just kind of randomly, wherever I feel is right. Now using our lightest color and a heavy pencil pressure, we're going to burnish the entire leaf area, shadows and all. For those of you who don't know what burnishing is, it's a technique where you layer and blend an area using a heavy pencil pressure until you can't see those little white spots showing through your drawing anymore. The white spots are the texture of the paper, also known as the tooth of the paper. So basically what I'm doing here is just tight scumbling with a heavy pencil pressure to grind down the texture and get rid of those white spots. As you do this, you'll notice that it should blend out all of the blue hues so they look softer and more green. So now we're actually getting pretty close to finishing off the leaves, but I'm feeling that they're still looking a little bit too yellow. So let's change that by scumbling in some more spring green using a medium to heavy pencil pressure. As we do this, we'll make sure to also scumble over and around all the blue hues. To help make our spheres look more lumpy and organic, we can add some jagged lines around the edge of the leaves using spring green. Finally, I'm also going to use yellow to burnish over the yellow and spring green areas to help blend the colors together more smoothly. Now let's move on to the trunk. As we do this, we're going to stick with the program from before, where in the first phase we just block in the colors, and in the second phase we add texture and burnish. Let's take a look at the rectangle that we drew for the trunk, and from now on, I want you to think of that as a cylinder. So keeping in mind where our light source is, let's block in a shadow using our darkest brown, dark umber, and a medium to light pencil pressure. But for now, I kind of want to leave the base of the trunk there, and I want to move on to the branches first. Since the branches are covered by leaves, they're in shadow and will be dark, so let's use some dark umber to evenly color in the branches with a medium to heavy pencil pressure. I recommend leaving some gaps in front of the branches, just so it looks like in some areas the branches are behind the leaves. Now let's get rid of those white areas between the branches and the leaves. Using Copenhagen Blue, we can scumble over the edge of the branches and just into the leafy area. Then let's switch to yellow and burnish over the leaves and the edges of the branches. Since I scumble over the branches a bit, I notice that the branches aren't as clear as they were before, so let's quickly redefine them by going over them again in light umber. Just before moving on, let's use dark umber to randomly darken a couple of the spots on the branches so that some areas look like they're more in shadow than others. So now that we're done that, I want to move on to the base of the trunk. But before we move too much further, we need to consider the shadow that the leaves are casting onto the trunk. A quick way to visualize where the shadow falls is to think of all of the leaves as one big sphere, and think of what kind of cast shadow that sphere would have. Now for the purposes of this drawing, the shadow definitely doesn't need to be perfect. We just want to get a sense that it's there. So I'm just going to draw a line on an angle that's loosely around where I think the shadow may hit the trunk, and then darken the area above with light umber and dark umber with a medium to heavy pencil pressure. As we do this, we'll continue to think of this section as a cylinder, just darker and without too much of a highlight because it's in shadow. So at the very bottom of the trunk, let's flare out the sides a tiny bit and add a few points for the roots. Then we can add some familiar lines to create texture. Using dark umber, let's draw in a couple of those U-shapes that we used in the leaves. The main difference now is that we want to be much more sparing with how many U's we put in, so just make sure that there's some space between them. Now I want to bring in a little bit more color. Since this side of the cylinder is being hit by more light, let's add a little bit of lemon yellow onto this side using a medium to light pencil pressure. You can use a heavier pencil pressure in this shadow area up here, just so you can see the color. On the shadow side of the cylinder, let's add some Copenhagen Blue into the shadow. Then once you've done that, you can lightly layer in some of your browns back on top. Now you might be wondering why we're putting these colors into the trunk. It's because, generally speaking, light is inherently warm while shadows are cool, meaning it's often a good idea to put down warmer colors like orange or yellow in areas being hit by a lot of light, and cool colors like blue or purple into the shadows. So with that said, the astute among you might have noticed that this is exactly what we've been doing with the leaves so far, with yellow in the highlights and blues in the shadows. So getting back to the trunk, using white, let's go over the highlight side with a medium pencil pressure to blend things together. If you aren't using an artist grade brand like Prismacolor or Faber-Castell, you could honestly just skip doing this part. A little while ago I did a video showing the difference between artist and student grade pencils, so go check that out and you'll see why. If you do have an artist grade pencil, gently going over the highlights will help to blend and smooth the details. Alright, so now at this point our drawing is looking pretty good and we're actually almost done. But there are a few things left to do still. In this final stage of the drawing, we just want to do a couple touch-ups. So let's take a step back, and rather than looking at the drawing as both a leaf section and a trunk section, let's take a look at the drawing as one cohesive whole to see if there's anything we still need to do. The first thing I notice is that I want to darken some of the shadows in the leaves because I feel like they're just not as dark as they could be, and I want a wider range of values. Next, I want the tree to look a little bit more bushy and organic. So let's make the outline of the leaves look a little bit more natural by adding a combination of messy U's, tight scumbling, and controlled scribbling around the edge. We'll go around the entire edge of the tree using spring green and a medium pencil pressure, and then we'll use the yellow in the areas where there's more highlights, and the blue in the area where there's more shadows. As we do this, I also want to change the shape of the leaves, just to make them less spherical and more natural. So let's shape some of these marks into gentle points. Finally, I'm just going to loosely suggest some grass and a shadow, and other than that, our drawing is pretty much done. If you found this helpful, consider liking and subscribing, and if you're here from TikTok or Instagram, welcome to my new channel. I know a lot of you have been asking for me to create YouTube videos, and I've also just been wanting to create them for quite a while now. So yeah, anyway, that's about it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.